I was reading a book here that had several letters in it, um, and one of them told a story of a dear Christian sister who was radically and powerfully converted from communism at the age of 19. The first thing she did was to go to a meeting of workers, communist workers, like a communist gathering, a pep rally, if you will, and stand before them. There's about 500 people, I would guess, there, and she loudly proclaimed the gospel. Um, this was something that's punishable by death in that. So she was basically immediately whisked away to a work camp where her life was unbearably hard on her. And if you're listening to this, it's easy to forget as Christians who have not experienced it, but historically, Christianity has always meant consequences, sometimes violent consequences for those who are believers. There's a price to being a Christian. In many, many parts of the world, this is still the case. Go over to the Voice of the Martyrs and read some of what they have to say. It's just gnarly. This is how it was in Isaac's day, in Paul's day. I mean, he was thrown in he spent a day and night in the deep. He was whipped and beaten with rods and stoned. And it is the case in many, many parts of the world once again. There is really nothing new under the sun, to quote Ecclesiastes. But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. Chris?
Definitely. Some good points. I kind of take a different angle on this, which is the angle of the persecution here of the two covenants, essentially as Paul's sort of using it in this metaphor, as the legalists against those that are under grace. And I think that persecution of the legalists, and at least maybe not in an extreme sense of the kind that we were talking about just a minute ago, but in a different type of persecution, it seems to be a description of human nature, that the legalists would want to persecute one who is living in grace simply because it doesn't seem fair. It's just a really deep-rooted thing. They're working hard to get God to be pleased with them. It doesn't seem right that they shouldn't have to work so hard. And I think that in one sense, the interpretation of the legalist, of the person that they see under grace or talking about grace and things, they see it wrongly as a justification for sin or a desire to sin. And I think that's what's mostly wrong. It's like any truth. It has people that take that truth and then use it for those ends. And there's certainly no shortage of people that have this radical view of grace that incorporates, and does justify sin. But that's not a correct criticism. In fact, Paul said so many times in this book, well, I just said it I think once in this book, but in the book of Romans, answering this charge where he would say, no, God forbid. That's not what I'm talking about. One example of this is in Romans 6, and I'll just read the 7 verses from this. I think it's really appropriate. What shall we say then? Shall we continue to sin, that grace may abound? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? Know ye not that so many of us were baptized into Jesus Christ, were baptized into his death? Therefore, we are buried with him by baptism into death, that, like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we have been planted together in likeness of his death, we shall also be in likeness of his resurrection, knowing this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not serve sin, for he that is dead is freed from sin. Mike?
Awesome. All right, here we go. Galatians chapter 4, verse 30. But what does the scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. This was what Sarah said to Abraham when Isaac and Ishmael were finally in the world, And briefly living, you might say, as, in the same family, in same communal family. We find out through Scripture that they end up having different inheritances and different destinies. The other interesting thing we see is that when Hagar is out in the wilderness, we see that God doesn't hang up on her. Now this is important to remember even in the context of the larger parable here, and especially in the context of Paul's parable here. The point Paul is making is that the son of the slave and the son of the bondwoman do not have the same inheritances. They are fundamentally different. We see that now, even today. Those who are still under that slavery of works-based righteousness have an inheritance that is fundamentally different than that of those who are born again by grace through faith. One is the heavenly Jerusalem, and one is not even the earthly Jerusalem, unfortunately. Chris?